In the summer of 1938, a photographer arranged the Kennedy family on the grounds of the American ambassador's residence in London. It was a formal sitting, the kind that ambassadors commissioned to signal stability, prosperity, and a certain kind of American confidence abroad. Joseph Kennedy Sr. stood at the center. Rose sat nearby. The children arranged themselves around their parents in descending order of age, dressed carefully, faces composed. The daughters are easy to find in the image. Rosemary, the eldest girl, stands slightly apart. Her expression is pleasant but imprecise, as though she is holding a pose she has been shown, rather than one she arrived at naturally. Kathleen, Kick, is beside her, and the difference is immediate. Kick looks directly at the camera with the ease of someone who has decided she belongs wherever she happens to be. The younger girls, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, are arranged toward the edges, still growing into the roles the family would eventually assign them. What the photograph required of each of them was the same thing the family required every day, that they appear without complication, that they reflect well, that nothing beneath the surface be legible to anyone looking. Rosemary Kennedy was 20 years old that summer. She had already spent the better part of her life being prepared for public appearances and shielded from their consequences. Her father was about to spend 3 more years searching for a solution to what he considered her problem before arriving at one that would end her life as the family had known it. Kathleen was 18. She had 10 years left. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy kept index cards on her children. This is documented, not a rumor, not an inference drawn from temperament. She maintained a physical file organized by child, tracking their medical appointments, their height and weight at various ages, their vaccinations, their academic progress, their dental records. It was a system, and she was proud of it. She described it in interviews later in her life as evidence of her attentiveness as a mother. What it also was, though she did not describe it this way, was a record-keeping practice more suited to a personnel department than a nursery. The Kennedy household in Brookline, Massachusetts, and later in Bronxville and Hyannisport ran on schedules, on competition, on the open measurement of performance. Meals were conducted as seminars. Joseph Kennedy Sr. expected his children to arrive at the table prepared to discuss current events, and he questioned them. Children who answered well were noted. Children who struggled were noted differently. The dinner table, by multiple accounts from within the family, was not a place of ease. It was the first arena. For the boys, this had a discernible destination. Joe Jr. was being prepared to run for office. John would follow. Robert would come after that. The path was not subtle. Joseph Sr. spoke about it directly, to his sons and to journalists. He had accumulated money and he intended to convert it into political power, and his sons were the instrument of that conversion. This was stated as ambition, even as vision. It was also looked at from the position of the children, a set of instructions that arrived before they were old enough to have formed preferences of their own. For the daughters, the destination was less specific, but not less total. They were to be beautiful, poised, educated enough to be impressive in conversation, and ultimately married to men who would extend the family's reach. Rose Kennedy had navigated exactly this path herself. She was the daughter of a Boston mayor, raised to be an asset to her family's political ambitions, married at 24 to a man whose drive was apparent from the beginning. She did not experience this as a constraint she had survived. She experienced it as the correct order of things, and she replicated it without apparent reservation. Kathleen was the second daughter, born in 1920, and she seemed almost unnaturally suited to what was asked of her. She was quick, socially fluent, funny in a way that put people at ease rather than unsettling them. Her father's attention landed on her more warmly than it did on some of the others, and she absorbed it and turned it outward, into charm, into confidence, into a quality that people around her consistently described as aliveness. She was not performing ease. She had it, or something close enough to it that the difference was invisible from the outside. Eunice was harder-edged, more serious, driven by something that looked more like her father's competitive energy than her mother's careful management. Patricia was quieter. Jean, the youngest daughter, was still a child through most of the 1930s, absorbing the family's atmosphere without yet being fully subject to its demands. And then there was Rosemary. Rosemary Kennedy was born in September 1918, the third Kennedy child, and the eldest daughter. Rose Kennedy would later say that the delivery had been difficult, that the doctor was delayed, and that a nurse attempting to slow the birth until he arrived had done something that may have interrupted oxygen to the infant for a critical period. Whether this account is precise is impossible to verify. What is documented is that Rosemary developed more slowly than her siblings from early infancy, that the gap widened rather than closed as she grew, and that by the time she was school-aged, it was apparent to her parents that she would not keep pace with her brothers and sisters academically or socially. What her parents did with this information is the first significant decision in this story. They did not withdraw her from family life. They did not, at least not initially, institutionalize her. What they did was construct a parallel management system, a set of tutors, carefully selected schools, rehearsed social scripts, designed to allow Rosemary to appear in public and at family functions as a normal Kennedy daughter. She was coached on what to say at dinner. She was accompanied at social events. Her letters, some of which survive, were written with assistants. The ones she wrote alone show labored, childlike handwriting and simple sentence structures, a stark contrast to the composed correspondence her siblings produced. The effort involved in this concealment was considerable. It required the sustained participation of tutors, nuns at the schools she attended, and family members themselves. It required that the people who spent time with Rosemary understand what was expected of them, which was to maintain the appearance, not to examine what lay beneath it. Some of these people, in accounts gathered decades later, describe genuine fondness for Rosemary. They also describe the clarity of the instruction. She was to be presented well, and questions were not invited. Joseph Kennedy's motivation for this approach appears to have been partly paternal. There are accounts of real tenderness between him and Rosemary, and partly something else. He was a man who had spent his career managing perception. He had maneuvered through anti-Catholic prejudice in Boston finance, through Hollywood, through the political machinery that had delivered him the ambassadorship. He understood at a practical level that the image a family projected had material consequences. A daughter who could not function at the level the family required was, in the vocabulary he operated in, a liability. Not a person to be hidden out of cruelty, necessarily, but a problem to be managed with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else. Rose Kennedy's response to Rosemary was different in texture, but not in conclusion. Her faith was central to her. She was a devout Catholic who understood suffering as something to be endured with grace rather than solved. She prayed. She consulted priests. She enrolled Rosemary in Catholic schools where the nuns were patient and the environment structured. She did not appear to experience this as a failure of the family, but as a cross. And crosses in the theology she practiced were not questioned. They were carried. What neither parent appears to have done in any documented account from this period is ask what Rosemary herself experienced, what she understood about her situation, whether the gap she could sense, and there is evidence she could sense it, between herself and her siblings, caused her pain. Her own voice exists only in fragments, in those labored letters, in a diary she kept briefly in her late teens that describes dances and outings, and the names of young men she found handsome. The diary reads like the record of someone trying very hard to have the experiences she had been told she was having. The index cards Rose kept did not record any of this. In 1938, the Kennedy family arrived in London. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had been appointed ambassador to the Court of St. James's by Franklin Roosevelt, an appointment that represented the furthest the family's social ambitions had yet traveled. London society in the late 1930s was stratified, watchful, and intensely attentive to presentation. It was precisely the kind of environment in which the management of appearances required no justification. Everyone there was managing appearances. The Kennedys simply brought their own particular version of the practice. For Rosemary, London presented both an opportunity and an intensified set of risks. The opportunity was genuine. She was, by all accounts from this period, a striking young woman, dark-haired with her mother's careful posture and something softer in her expression than her siblings carried. When she was at ease in small groups or familiar settings, she could be warm and engaged. The risks were equally genuine. London's social season involved a specific sequence of formal events: presentations at court, debutante balls, dinners at which conversation moved quickly and without scaffolding, and Rosemary's ability to navigate these unassisted was limited. The solution her parents arrived at was the same one they had been refining for years, applied now at a higher level of pressure. Rosemary was presented at Buckingham Palace in May 1938 alongside Kathleen. The presentation required a curtsy performed at a precise moment, a particular sequence of movements, a composure held under the direct gaze of the king and queen. Rosemary had practiced it. She performed it successfully. The photographs from that afternoon show her in white court dress, looking composed, even luminous. No one in that room, by all available accounts, detected anything unusual. What those photographs required, in preparation, in rehearsal, in the sustained nervous attention of the people surrounding her, is not visible in them. That is precisely what they were designed to accomplish. The nuns at the Assumption Convent in Roehampton, where Rosemary was enrolled during the London years, left some of the more candid accounts of her from this period. They described her as sweet-natured and eager to please, and they also described the gap between her abilities and what was expected of her as something that caused her visible distress. She knew she was slower. She knew her letters took longer, that she lost the thread of conversations her siblings moved through effortlessly, that certain things which appeared automatic for others required from her a concentrated effort that still sometimes ended in failure. The nuns noted that she cried more frequently than her age would have suggested, and that the crying often followed social situations, dinners, group events, in which she had been required to perform. This detail, small and institutional as it sounds, is significant. It places Rosemary not as an unknowing participant in her family's management of her, but as someone who experienced the distance between what she was expected to be and what she was. She was not shielded from the knowledge of her own difference. She lived with it quietly, in a household that had made clear the difference was not to be spoken of. Kathleen's position in relation to Rosemary during this period was its own kind of complicated. The two sisters were close, and this is consistent across accounts. And Kik was, by temperament, the sibling most likely to absorb someone else's discomfort and redirect it without making it worse. She had an instinct for deflection that read as kindness, and often was. At the debutante balls and dinners of the London season, Kathleen appears repeatedly in accounts as a presence near Rosemary, close enough to intervene if a conversation began to go wrong, unobtrusive enough that the intervention was not visible as intervention. What this required of Kathleen is worth considering. She was 18 years old during the London season, in the middle of her own social debut, navigating her own set of expectations and observations, and she was also, simultaneously, functioning as a quiet management apparatus for her sister's safety in public. She did not appear to resent it, at least not in any account that survives, but it established something between the two sisters, a dynamic in which Kathleen's competence was partly defined by its usefulness to Rosemary, and Rosemary's vulnerability was something Kathleen had partial responsibility for managing. By 1940, the family had returned to the United States. The war had made London untenable, and Joseph Kennedy's relationship with Roosevelt had deteriorated badly. His public statements suggesting that Britain would fall, and his private communications later revealed that indicating a willingness to accommodate German power, had effectively ended his political usefulness to the administration. He resigned the ambassadorship in November 1940. The family's extraordinary London chapter closed, and with it the particular social machinery that had been constructed to carry Rosemary through it. Back in the United States, the question of what to do with Rosemary sharpened. She was 22. The structure of school and convent and supervised social appearances had provided a framework within which she could be managed, but it was not a framework that could extend indefinitely. The family's public life was accelerating. Joe Jr. was moving toward politics. John was moving in the same direction. The family name was becoming something with a specific weight in American public life. And Rosemary's situation was becoming harder to contain within the story the family was constructing about itself. There were also reports, more difficult to verify precisely but consistent across several accounts, that Rosemary's behavior had become less predictable, that she had begun at times to leave the house without permission, to return late, to be found in situations that the family considered dangerous. Some accounts suggest she had become involved with men her family did not know. Whether these episodes were expressions of ordinary young adult impulse, the kind of behavior that would have been managed differently in a different family, or ignored entirely, or whether they represented something more medically significant is not fully recoverable from the available record. What is recoverable is that Joseph Kennedy experienced them as a crisis, not a medical one primarily, and not an emotional one, a reputational one. The family was on the verge of something, politically, socially, or in Rosemary's unpredictability was a variable he had run out of ways to control through the methods he had been using. He began in 1941 to look for a different kind of solution. Kathleen Kennedy returned to England in 1943, and the decision to do so was entirely her own. She was 23, working at the Washington Times-Herald as a journalist, a position she had taken partly through family connection and partly through genuine aptitude. And the war had been running for 2 years. The young men she had known in London were there, and some of them were already dead, and the city she had moved through so easily during the debutante season was now blacked out and rationed, and under a different kind of pressure entirely. She went anyway. She joined the American Red Cross as a program worker and boarded a ship to England in the summer of that year. Her family's reaction to this was mixed in ways that track precisely along the lines of what each of them valued. Her father appears to have understood it. He had watched her in London, had seen how she operated in that world, and there was between them a recognition that she was, in temperament, more like him than any of his other children. Her mother's reaction was more constrained. Rose Kennedy had reservations about the propriety of a young woman moving voluntarily toward a war zone. And she had other reservations, ones that would become more significant later, about the company Kathleen was likely to keep once she arrived. London in 1943 was not London in 1938. The social architecture that had structured the debutante season, the formal presentations, the carefully managed dinners, the network of families who had been performing the same rituals for generations, had been compressed and accelerated by the war into something less formal and considerably more intense. People who would not have spent time together in peacetime were spending time together now in the compressed geography of a city that was intermittently being bombed, and the usual mechanisms for maintaining social distance had loosened. Kathleen arrived into this and recognized it immediately as a version of something she already knew how to navigate. The Cavendish family entered her life again almost immediately. She had met William Cavendish, Billy, the Marquis of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, during the 1938 season, when she had been 18 and he had been 19, and something had registered between them then that had not resolved itself in the intervening years. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, not the most brilliant person in a room, but one of the most genuinely decent. Tall, slightly awkward, with a seriousness about him that coexisted with a dry humor, he deployed quietly. He was not performing the ease that Kathleen had. His was a different quality, a kind of steadiness, and she responded to it. The problem was architectural. The Cavendishes were Protestant, not nominally Protestant, not Protestant in the attenuated way that might have permitted negotiation, but Protestant in the way that the English aristocracy had been Protestant for 400 years. Their faith and their identity and their institutional position were not separable from one another. Billy would one day inherit Chatsworth, one of the great houses of England. The Dukes of Devonshire had historically held positions of importance within the Church of England. The family's Protestantism was woven into what they were. Kathleen was Catholic in a way that was equally non-negotiable, though for different reasons. Her mother's faith was the organizing principle of Rose Kennedy's entire interior life. It was not background or habit. It was the structure through which Rose understood suffering, duty, marriage, and the proper order of a woman's existence. A Kennedy daughter marrying outside the church, and worse, marrying into a family whose institutional identity was bound up in opposing Catholicism, was not, in Rose Kennedy's framework, a personal preference to be weighed against other considerations. It was a spiritual matter of the most serious kind. Kathleen understood all of this. She had understood it since 1938, when whatever had begun between her and Billy during the season had been quietly set aside as impossible. What changed in 1943 was that the war had imposed a different relationship with time. People who might have spent years negotiating the social and theological distance between their families were instead making decisions in compressed windows, aware that the windows might close without warning. Billy was in the army. He would be sent to France eventually. The question of how much time there was had become concrete in a way it had not been before. Through the autumn and winter of 1943 and into 1944, Kathleen and Billy spent time together in London, in the company of a social world that was by this point largely made up of people in uniform, people waiting, people who had already lost someone and expected to lose more. The group they moved through included figures who would later become significant in British public life, and the accounts they left describe Kathleen as a specific kind of presence in it, someone who brought energy without frivolity, who could be in a room full of grief and not be flattened by it or insensitive to it. Billy's friends liked her. His family, with careful English restraint, indicated something closer to genuine warmth. What was not discussed openly but was understood by everyone was the religious question. Various negotiations were attempted. A Catholic priest was consulted. The possibility of Billy converting or of the children of the marriage being raised Catholic was raised and examined and found incompatible with what the Cavendish family's position required. The Church's position on mixed marriages was equally firm. There was no arrangement that satisfied both sides, and Kathleen, who understood this as clearly as anyone, continued anyway. She wrote to her father during this period with a directness she did not use with her mother. The letters describe her awareness of what she was choosing, and they describe her choosing it with her eyes open, rather than in the grip of an emotion that had overridden her judgment. She was not lost. She was deciding. The distinction mattered to her, and she was careful to make it legible to him. What she did not write to him or to anyone else in a way that survives was what she expected to lose. She knew her mother's position. She knew the Church's position. She knew that the life she was moving toward would require her to exist at a permanent angle to the family she had come from. She moved toward it anyway, and the spring of 1944 was coming. The wedding took place on May 6, 1944, at the Chelsea Register Office in London. It was a civil ceremony, which meant it was not recognized by the Catholic Church, which meant that in Rose Kennedy's understanding of the world, her daughter was not being married at all. She was committing a public act of spiritual abandonment. The room was small. The guest list was limited by wartime and by circumstance, and by the fact that the occasion was not, for everyone involved, straightforwardly a celebration. Billy's parents attended. His family's presence was warm and genuine. From the Kennedy side, only one family member was there, Joe Jr., who had flown over from his naval air station, who stood with his sister in the register office and signed as a witness, and whose presence was an act of loyalty that cost him something with his mother, and that he appears to have provided without hesitation. Rose Kennedy did not come. This is the central fact of the day, and it requires sitting with rather than moving past. Her eldest daughter was being married in a foreign country in wartime, and Rose did not get on a plane. She sent a telegram. The content of the telegram was not congratulatory in any uncomplicated sense. It conveyed, in the compressed language of the form, her grief and her opposition, and it arrived on the morning of the wedding and was read by Kathleen before she went to the register office. What Kathleen did with that information, whether she folded it somewhere and went ahead, or whether it was present in her face during the ceremony in some way that the photographs do not show, is not recoverable. The photographs show her in a pale pink dress, laughing, her hand in Billy's arm, looking like someone who has just done something she intended to do. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was also not there, but his absence was different in character. He had been working, through back channels, to find some arrangement that would permit the marriage without the full rupture with the Church. He consulted the Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal O'Connell's successor, and other church figures searching for a dispensation or a formulation that would give Kathleen a way through. None was available. His absence from the wedding was not indifference. The record suggests genuine anguish on his part. But he had also, in the end, not been able to produce an alternative, and Kathleen had not waited. The reaction from the Catholic press in America was immediate and severe. Columnists wrote about the Kennedy daughter who had abandoned her faith for an English lord. Letters arrived at the family's various addresses. The church community in Boston, which was a significant part of the social world the Kennedys had come from and still depended on, registered the marriage as a kind of defection. Rose Kennedy, who had built her public identity around her faith and her family's Catholicism, was now publicly associated with a daughter who had done the thing that identity most explicitly prohibited. What this meant for Kathleen practically was that she had married into one world and been partially expelled from another, and the expulsion was not metaphorical. When she returned to the United States after the war, as she did briefly, the social geography had shifted. The Kennedy family's Catholic network, the priests who came to dinner, the families whose approval Rose cultivated, the institutional church connections that formed part of the family's social infrastructure, treated Kathleen's presence with a coolness that had not been there before. She was not disowned. The family did not use that language and would not have. But the warmth had a new condition attached to it, and the condition was that her marriage was to be understood as a mistake, a lapse, something that had happened rather than something she had chosen. Rose Kennedy's response to the marriage, as it developed over the months following, was to treat it primarily as a spiritual problem. Hers, not Kathleen's. She prayed, she went to Mass, she spoke to priests. In her memoir written decades later, she described her state in the period after the wedding in terms of religious suffering, of offering her pain to God, of finding consolation in faith. What she did not describe in any passage that survives was Kathleen's happiness, whether Billy was kind, what the marriage looked like from the inside for her daughter. The interior life of the woman who had just gotten married does not appear in Rose Kennedy's account of the event. Billy Hartington had been granted leave for the wedding, and it lasted 2 weeks. He returned to his regiment in mid-May. The Allied invasion of France was being planned. Both of them knew this, as anyone paying attention knew this. And the leave had been an interval, not an arrival. Kathleen moved into a flat in London and resumed her Red Cross work and waited, in the way that everyone in London was waiting in the late spring of 1944, for the thing that was coming. The invasion came in June. Billy crossed to France with his regiment, the Coldstream Guards, in the summer push that followed the initial landings. Kathleen received letters from him. They survive, and they have the quality of letters written by someone who is trying to give the person reading them something to hold on to without lying about the situation he is in. He was not a man who dramatized, and the letters are not dramatic. They are careful and affectionate and occasionally funny, and they describe a war that is moving and brutal and consuming the men around him at a rate that he does not conceal from her. The marriage had lasted, in terms of time spent in the same place, approximately 14 days. What Kathleen had accepted in order to enter it, the rupture with her mother, the church's non-recognition, the cooling of the family's Catholic world, the permanent repositioning of herself relative to her own history, had been paid in full before the marriage had the chance to become anything more than a beginning. She was 24 years old, living alone in a wartime city, waiting for letters from a man she had known she wanted to marry since she was 18, and the letters were still coming. In September 1944, they stopped. The telegram reached Kathleen in London. She was at a friend's house when the news arrived, and the accounts of the immediate aftermath describe a stillness rather than a collapse. People who were present said she went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. She did not, in the hours that followed, produce the kind of visible grief that the occasion seemed to call for. This was noted, and it was misread by some as composure, which it was not, or as coldness, which it also was not. It was something closer to a state in which the ordinary mechanisms for processing information had simply stopped working for a period of time. She wrote to her father almost immediately. The letter is brief and direct. She tells him Billy is dead. She tells him she is all right. She tells him she does not want him to worry. The brevity is its own communication. She had, in the past year, written him long letters full of observation and argument and the specific texture of her daily life in London. This letter has none of that. It has the quality of a message sent from a place where language has not yet reattached to experience. Joseph Kennedy flew to London within days. His presence there, in the accounts that survive from people who saw them together, was one of the more straightforward expressions of genuine feeling in his record as a father. He did not, on this occasion, manage. He came and he sat with her, and he was present in the way that she needed someone to be present, and the people who observed them together noted that the relationship between them, always the warmest in the family, was visible in how he handled it. He did not try to reframe the loss or redirect it toward anything useful. He was simply there. Rose Kennedy wrote. The letter she sent Kathleen following Billy's death acknowledged the grief, and it also, within the same document, returned to the question of the church. Rose expressed the hope, carefully in the language of faith rather than instruction, that this loss might be understood as part of a larger design, that Kathleen might find her way back to the church as a source of consolation, that the door that had appeared to close with the marriage might now reopen. The letter has been quoted in various Kennedy biographies, and each time it appears it produces a version of the same response in readers. A recognition of how completely Rose Kennedy's framework ordered everything that entered it, including her daughter's bereavement. Kathleen did not return to the church. She remained in England. This decision, which she does not appear to have agonized over publicly, was in itself a statement about where she had placed herself. She was now the Marchioness of Hartington. The title had transferred with the marriage, and she was the widow of a man whose family had taken her in with genuine warmth, and England was the place where that warmth existed. The Kennedy family's American world, with its Catholic infrastructure and its management of appearances and its complicated response to what she had chosen, was on the other side of the Atlantic. She stayed where she had fewer things to navigate. The Devonshire family's treatment of her in widowhood was, by all accounts, straightforwardly decent. The Duke and Duchess had lost their son, and Kathleen had lost her husband, and that shared loss appears to have organized their relationship in a way that required no further negotiation. She was included. She was invited to Chatsworth and to the family's other properties. She was treated as belonging, which was not something she had been able to take for granted on the other side. What her life looked like in practical terms during the year or two following Billy's death is a life that was reconstructing itself in small increments. She returned to her Red Cross work. She saw friends. She moved through the particular social world of post-war London, which was exhausted and diminished, and also, in the way of places that have been through something together, intensely alive in the company of people who had survived it. She was 25 and a widow, and one of the more socially capable people in any room she entered, and she used those things not to perform recovery, but because the alternative was a stillness that she appears to have recognized as dangerous. Her brother Joe Jr. was dead by this point as well. He had been killed in August 1944, a month before Billy, in an experimental aircraft mission over the English Channel. The plane exploded in flight. He was 29. Within 6 weeks, Kathleen had lost her husband and her brother, the sibling who had stood with her at the register office, the one who had come when it mattered, the one whose understanding of her had been the least conditional in the family. She did not write at length about Joe Jr.'s death in the surviving correspondence from this period. There is a letter to her father in which she says she finds herself unable to think about it directly yet, that it is too close. This is one of the few moments in the record where Kathleen Kennedy's fluency breaks down, where the instrument she used to process experience and make it communicable simply refuses to function. The letter trails off rather than concludes. By 1946, she had begun to move again more visibly through London social life. She was seen at dinners and country weekends and the reconstituting events of a post-war aristocratic world that was already beginning to understand it was operating on borrowed time. She had friends who loved her and a family position through the Devonshires that was secure. She had no obvious direction. Billy Hartington had been killed on September 9th, 1944, near the village of Heppen in Belgium. A sniper's bullet during an advance that had been going well until it wasn't. He was 26 years old. He had been married for 4 months. The marriage had lasted, in terms of time spent in the same place, approximately 14 days. The leave granted for the wedding, and then his return to his regiment, and then the letters stopping. What Kathleen had accepted in order to enter that marriage, the rupture with her mother, the church's non-recognition, the cooling of the family's Catholic world, the permanent repositioning of herself relative to her own history, had been paid in full before the marriage had the chance to become anything more than a beginning. She also, at some point in 1946 or early 1947, met Peter Fitzwilliam. While Kathleen was navigating London in the years before her marriage, Rosemary Kennedy's situation in the United States was moving toward a different kind of conclusion. The timeline runs parallel and does not intersect, but the simultaneity matters. In 1941, While one daughter was preparing to make the most consequential choice of her life, another was having the most consequential choice of her life made for her. Rosemary was 22 in 1940, 23 in 1941. The structure that had held her, the convent schools, the supervised appearances, the careful social scripting, had been, for all its limitations, a structure. It had given her days a shape and her family a set of known variables to manage. When the family returned from London, that structure lost some of its coherence. The particular English institutions that had absorbed her were no longer available. The social world of the ambassadorship, which had provided legitimate occasions for supervised public appearances, had closed. What remained was the family's American life, which was accelerating in a direction that had less and less room for the management Rosemary required. She was living at this point partly at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport and partly at a convent school in Washington, D.C., St. Gertrude's, where the nuns provided the kind of structured daily life that had worked for her in England. The arrangement was functional, but increasingly provisional. Rosemary was not a child, and the institutions designed for the management of her situation were institutions designed in the main for children. What she needed and what no one around her appears to have asked her about, was a framework for adult life. What she got instead was a continued attempt to fit her into a modified version of the childhood framework, stretched past the point where it could comfortably hold. The accounts from this period that describe her behavior as having become more difficult to manage are worth examining carefully because the word difficult does significant work in them without being precisely defined. Some accounts describe mood swings, episodes of anger, a new unpredictability in her responses to frustration. Others describe the behavior in terms that sound less like pathology and more like the ordinary consequences of a young woman's situation. She was being supervised constantly. Her movements were restricted. She was aware that her siblings were living expanding and autonomous lives while hers was contracting, and she had no language, no framework, no permission to name what that cost her. If her responses to this situation were at times sharp or unpredictable, the category of difficult may have been doing a great deal of work to convert a comprehensible reaction into a medical problem. What Joseph Kennedy experienced, though, was not a young woman responding to a constrained life. What he experienced was a set of behavioral episodes that threatened the management system he had maintained for 2 decades. There are accounts, consistent across multiple sources, though details vary, that Rosemary had been found outside the convent at night, that she had been interacting with men her family did not know, that there had been at least one episode that Joseph Kennedy interpreted as a serious risk. The specifics are not fully recoverable. What is recoverable is the response they produced in him. He began consulting physicians in 1941. The medical landscape for intellectual disability at this point in American history was not a landscape of care in any meaningful sense. It was a landscape of management, of institutions, of the sorting of people into categories that served administrative convenience more than individual need. The terminology in use, moron, imbecile, idiot, in their then clinical meanings, reflected a framework that had been shaped by eugenic thinking, by the premise that certain kinds of minds were problems to be contained rather than people to be supported. Joseph Kennedy moved through this landscape as he moved through every professional landscape, purposefully, with money, looking for the solution that suited his requirements. He found Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts. Freeman was the more prominent of the two, a neurologist at George Washington University, who had become the primary American advocate for a procedure developed in Portugal by Egas Moniz, the prefrontal lobotomy. The procedure involved severing connections in the frontal lobe of the brain, and its claimed effect was the reduction of emotional disturbance, of agitation, of the behavioral unpredictability that Freeman's framework categorized as symptoms. It had been performed on several hundred patients in the United States by 1941. The results were inconsistent. The risks were significant. The procedure was, in the medical literature of the time, still experimental in important respects, and the range of outcomes documented included cases in which patients had been left severely impaired. Freeman and Watts met with Joseph Kennedy in 1941. The details of what was discussed are not fully documented. There is no transcript, no contemporaneous account from either physician that covers the full conversation. What is known is that Freeman described the procedure to Kennedy in terms that emphasized its potential to calm Rosemary, to reduce her agitation, to make her more manageable. Kennedy asked, by Freeman's later account, about the possibility that it would improve her intellectual functioning. Freeman indicated it might. This claim was not supported by the existing evidence even at the time. Rose Kennedy was not part of this conversation. This is documented. She has stated in her own memoir that she was not consulted, that she did not know the procedure was being planned, that she learned of it after it had already been performed. Whether Joseph Kennedy withheld this information from her deliberately, or whether the decision moved so quickly through his particular mode of operation that consulting her simply did not register as a necessary step, is not resolvable from the available record. What is resolvable is the fact: the decision to perform an irreversible neurological procedure on their daughter was made by one parent alone, without the knowledge of the other. Rosemary was not asked. There is no account from any source that describes her being given information about the procedure and invited to respond to it. She was 23 years old. She was brought to the hospital. The procedure was performed. The date was sometime in late 1941. The exact date does not appear in any record the family retained. The procedure itself was described by James Watts in a later account that has become one of the primary sources for what happened in that operating room. Watts performed the surgical component while Freeman directed. Rosemary was kept awake during the operation. This was standard practice for the procedure at the time, because the surgeons used the patient's verbal responses to gauge the depth of the intervention. They asked her to recite prayers, to count, to sing songs. As Watts cut further into the frontal lobe tissue, her responses changed. They became simpler, then they became fragmented. Then they stopped being coherent responses at all and became something else: sounds, incomplete words, a trailing off that Watts described in his account in clinical language that does not conceal what it was describing. At the point where her responses ceased to be intelligible, the surgeons stopped. The outcome was catastrophic. The Rosemary Kennedy who had been brought to that hospital, who had written labored but legible letters, who had kept a diary, who had danced at debutante balls and performed a curtsy before the King and Queen of England, who had cried after social events that went wrong and laughed during ones that went right, who had noticed young men she found handsome and written their names down, did not come back out. What came out was a woman who had lost the ability to speak clearly, who could not control movement on the left side of her body, who was incontinent, who required total care. The procedure had not reduced her to a manageable version of herself. It had not produced the calmer, more placid Rosemary that Freeman had suggested was possible. It had destroyed the functioning she had. Joseph Kennedy's response to this outcome is one of the more documented silences in the family record. He did not speak about it, not to his wife, not to his other children, not to journalists, not in correspondence that has survived. He arranged within a relatively short period for Rosemary to be transferred to a care facility. The facility he chose was St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, a Catholic institution run by nuns in a small city more than 1,000 miles from the family's primary residences. He paid for her care. He did not visit. The silence extended outward from him into the family. Rose Kennedy has written that she did not see Rosemary for approximately 20 years following the procedure. This statement, made in her memoir, is offered without extended commentary on what it cost her, or on what the 20 years looked like from Rosemary's side. It appears in the memoir as a fact, bracketed by faith, by the language of God's will and the mystery of suffering. Rose did not visit her daughter for 20 years. The other Kennedy children were told in the immediate aftermath that Rosemary had suffered a mental breakdown of some kind. The lobotomy was not described to them. The specifics of what had been done and what had resulted were not shared. Kathleen, who was closest to Rosemary among the siblings, was in England when it happened, and the account she received was incomplete. Whether she suspected more than she was told is not knowable from the record. What is knowable is that the sister who had stood near her at debutante balls, and whose vulnerability she had spent years quietly managing, had disappeared from her life without adequate explanation. And she did not push for a more complete one, at least not in any way that left a trace. The Kennedy family's public life continued without interruption. Joseph Kennedy did not withdraw from social or professional life following the procedure. The political machinery oriented around his sons continued to turn. The family appeared at events, gave interviews, cultivated the image that had been under construction since the ambassadorship. The management of appearance, which had been the family's primary response to Rosemary's existence from the beginning, simply absorbed her disappearance as it had absorbed everything else. She was gone, and the family continued, and the absence was managed by not mentioning it. What Rosemary's daily life consisted of at St. Coletta in the years following the lobotomy is recoverable in partial outlines from accounts given by the nuns who cared for her. She had a small cottage on the grounds eventually, built for her with Kennedy money. She had caregivers, nuns who knew her, who spent time with her, who by all accounts treated her with genuine kindness. Her days had structure, meals, activities suited to her now severely limited capacities, walks on the grounds. She could not have a conversation in any ordinary sense. She could not read or write. The cottage was comfortable. The grounds were peaceful. She was, in the most literal sense, entirely alone. The family's fame grew around her during these years in a way that had its own particular texture. Her brothers became figures of national significance. John Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946, to the Senate in 1952. The Kennedy name was becoming something that appeared in newspapers with regularity, that carried a specific weight in American political and social life, that was being actively constructed into a kind of American story. Rosemary existed at no point in this story. She had been edited out with a thoroughness that required ongoing maintenance. Journalists who asked about her were given vague answers. Family friends who inquired were redirected. Her name was simply absent from the public record of a family whose other members were becoming public in an unusually total way. The nuns at St. Coletta, in the accounts they gave later, described a woman who responded to kindness, who smiled, who had preferences, who could communicate in limited ways what she liked and did not like. They described her as content, on balance, within the life she had. They were careful not to claim more than they knew. What they did not describe, because they could not know it, was what Rosemary understood about the world outside her cottage. Whether she knew her brothers were presidents and senators, whether she knew her sisters appeared in newspapers, whether she had any framework for understanding what had happened to her and why she was where she was. No one in the documented record appears to have considered it their responsibility to tell her. Peter Fitzwilliam was everything that made sense to Kathleen Kennedy, and nothing that would make sense to anyone trying to explain her choices to her family. He was Anglo-Irish, fabulously wealthy, a war hero of genuine distinction. He had served with the RAF and accumulated a record that was not performed bravery, but the actual kind, the kind that left marks. He was also married, Protestant, and possessed of a reputation for recklessness in his personal life that was not a rumor, but a well-documented feature of how he moved through the world. He drank, he gambled, he pursued women with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a consequence he could not spend his way past. He was 37 when Kathleen met him, and he had the quality which certain men of that type carry of making ordinary caution feel like a failure of imagination. Kathleen was 27. She had been a widow for 2 years. She had remained in England, had rebuilt something resembling a daily life, had moved through the post-war social world with her characteristic fluency, and she had arrived, by some combination of circumstance and temperament, at Peter Fitzwilliam. The accounts of people who knew them together describe a dynamic that was visibly different from what she had had with Billy, less steady, more charged, organized around a kind of mutual recognition that two people from different directions had occasionally for each other. Billy had offered her solidity. Fitzwilliam offered her something harder to name and, on the evidence, harder to resist. She knew what he was. This is important to establish because the temptation in retrospect is to read her involvement with him as a lapse in judgment, a grief-driven mistake, a young woman temporarily unable to distinguish between intensity and reliability. The record does not support this reading. Kathleen Kennedy was not a person who failed to see things clearly. She had understood exactly what she was choosing when she married Billy, had written her father a letter that demonstrated the full scope of her awareness, and had chosen it anyway. Her involvement with Fitzwilliam had the same quality. She could see what he was, she knew the complications, and she moved toward it with her eyes open. What she wanted from it, beyond the obvious, is harder to recover. There are accounts suggesting she had decided to marry him, that she intended to pursue a divorce from his current wife, or that she expected him to, and that she had mapped a future in which this was the shape her life would take. Whether this reflected genuine expectation or the particular optimism that Fitzwilliam seems to have inspired in people who spent significant time with him is not fully resolvable. What is resolvable is that by early 1948, the relationship was serious enough that Kathleen felt it required a conversation with her father. The conversation she needed to have with Joseph Kennedy was not a simple one. She was asking him, in effect, to absorb another version of the same rupture, another man outside the church, another set of complications for the family's public image, another occasion for Rose Kennedy's grief. But the divorce element added a dimension that hadn't been present before. The Catholic Church's position on divorce was even less negotiable than its position on mixed marriages. A Kennedy daughter seeking to marry a divorced man would not be a matter of dispensation or careful management. It would be a full break, public and irrecoverable. Joseph Kennedy agreed to meet. This is the part of the story that requires attention, because his agreement was not a small thing. He was, by 1948, a man whose health was declining and whose political investment was shifting entirely toward John. Joe Jr. was dead. The plan had reorganized itself, and everything now ran through Jack. The family's image, the Catholic constituency, the Boston political infrastructure, all of it mattered in specific and material ways. Agreeing to meet about Kathleen and Fitzwilliam was agreeing to engage with something that could damage all of it. He agreed anyway. He had always, when it came to Kathleen specifically, found ways to be present that he did not find for his other children. The meeting was arranged for the south of France. The Kennedys had connections there. It was neutral enough ground. It was away from both London and the American press. Joseph Kennedy would travel from the United States. Kathleen and Fitzwilliam would travel from London. They decided to fly. Fitzwilliam had access to a small charter plane, a de Havilland Dove, and the plan was to stop in Cannes briefly before continuing to meet her father. The stop in Cannes was Fitzwilliam's idea. He wanted to watch a horse race. This detail appears in the accounts without apparent significance the first time you encounter it, and then settles into place later as the kind of detail that becomes unbearable in retrospect. The ordinary self-indulgence of a wealthy man who assumed there was always more time. They arrived in Cannes on May 13, 1948. The horse race Fitzwilliam wanted to see was run. They had dinner. They stayed longer than the original plan had specified because Fitzwilliam was Fitzwilliam, and plans were suggestions. On the morning of May 14th, they prepared to depart for the meeting with her father. The weather over the Rhone Valley was deteriorating. The pilot was aware of this. There are accounts suggesting the conditions were considered marginal for the aircraft they were flying, and that the assessment of whether to proceed was made in the way assessments were often made in Fitzwilliam's orbit. With the confidence of people who had not yet been wrong in a way that mattered. Kathleen was 28 years old. She had, in the past 4 years, buried her husband and her brother, navigated the slow cooling of her family's Catholic world, rebuilt herself in a country that was not her own, and arrived at a point where she was flying south to ask her father to accept one more version of her, choosing her own life. The meeting with Joseph Kennedy was scheduled for that afternoon. The de Havilland Dove took off from Cannes on the morning of May 14th into weather that was already wrong. A storm system was moving through the Rhone Valley, the kind of fast-moving convective weather that builds quickly over mountainous terrain, and that small charter aircraft of that era had limited instrumentation to navigate. The pilot climbed into it anyway. Whether this decision reflected inadequate information, a miscalculation of the storm's speed, or the pressure that Fitzwilliam's manner of occupying the world tended to exert on people around him, is not fully recoverable. What is recoverable is that the plane entered cloud cover over the Cevennes Mountains in southern France and did not come out the other side intact. The wreckage was found on a mountainside near Privas in the Ardèche region later that day. There were no survivors. The 4 people on board, Kathleen, Fitzwilliam, the pilot, and a 4th passenger, had died on impact. Kathleen Kennedy Hartington was 28 years old. Joseph Kennedy was waiting in the south of France when the news reached him. The accounts of this moment are brief and consistent. He was told, and he broke down in a way that people who had known him for years had never seen him do. He had lost Joe Jr. to the war, and now Kathleen to weather and a horse race, and a man whose confidence had outrun his caution, and the two losses together appear to have done something to him that the record registers but cannot fully contain. He flew to identify her body. He made the arrangements. He did these things alone. Rose Kennedy was in Paris when she was told. Her response in the immediate aftermath and in the accounts she gave later returned immediately to the framework that organized everything for her. God's will, the mystery of suffering, the meaning that faith supplied when ordinary meaning failed. She had not approved of the relationship with Fitzwilliam. She had not reconciled herself to Kathleen's marriage to Billy. The death arrived inside a grief that was already complicated by years of opposition, and the complications did not dissolve in the face of it. They remained layered under the loss, shaping how it was held. The funeral took place in England, at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Edensor, on the grounds of the Chatsworth estate. The Devonshire family organized it. The Duke and Duchess were present, and Billy's family, and the English friends who had formed the world Kathleen had chosen. From the Kennedy family, Joseph Kennedy came. He sat in the church in the Cavendish family's village and buried his daughter in English soil among the people she had chosen over the ones who had wanted her to choose differently. Rose Kennedy did not attend. This fact has been noted in every account of Kathleen's death, and it continues to produce a particular response in anyone who encounters it, which is not quite shock. Rose's framework has been established clearly enough by this point that her absence is comprehensible. But something more like a recognition of how completely a system of belief can organize a person against the most basic human responses. Her daughter was being buried. She did not go. The grave is in Edensor churchyard, marked with a stone that identifies her as Kathleen, Marchioness of Hartington, daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy, Ambassador of the United States of America. The inscription was chosen by her father. It identifies her in relation to him and in relation to the title she acquired through her marriage. The marriage Rose did not attend and did not recognize and did not grieve in any way she made visible. In the United States, the reaction to her death was shaped by the same Catholic press that had condemned her marriage. Several newspapers noted her passing in terms that managed within the conventions of obituary language to imply that the manner of her death, in the company of a married man, was related in some moral sense to the choices she had made. This was done with the kind of editorial restraint that makes the implication more rather than less present. It did not require explicit condemnation. The framework was sufficiently shared that suggestion was enough. The Kennedy family did not respond publicly to these characterizations. Joseph Kennedy's grief was private and remained so. He did not speak to journalists about Kathleen. He did not give interviews about her death or her life or what she had meant to him. He returned to the United States and to the political project that was now organized entirely around John, and the silence around Kathleen settled into place alongside the silence around Rosemary. In Faidu Braham Poetics, 2 daughters, 2 absences, managed by the same mechanism of not speaking. What the family did with Kathleen's memory in the years following her death was to hold it selectively. Among themselves in private, she was mourned and spoken of with genuine feeling. John Kennedy, in particular, kept her memory alive in a way that was personal and specific, kept photographs of her, spoke of her to friends. But publicly, in the Kennedy narrative that was being constructed through the 1950s as John's political career accelerated, Kathleen was largely absent. The story the family told about itself, Catholic, unified, directed toward public service, did not have an obvious place for a daughter who had died in France with a married Protestant man on the way to ask her father to sanction her divorce. She was not erased the way Rosemary was erased. Her name was said. Her existence was acknowledged. But she was not present in the story, and the difference between acknowledgement and presence is significant in a family that understood narrative as carefully as the Kennedys did. The Devonshire family kept her memory differently. She remained, in the accounts of people who had known her in England, a vivid and specific presence. People who had been young with her in London described her decades later with the particular precision reserved for people who made a genuine impression. The warmth was real, and it was hers, and it existed on the other side of the Atlantic from the family that had produced her, tended by people she had chosen rather than inherited. The grave in Edensor remains. The Chatsworth estate still stands above it. Eunice Kennedy was the third daughter, born in 1921, and she had spent her formative years watching. This is not a romantic characterization. It is a structural one. In a family organized around the performance of competence, she had grown up behind Kathleen, who was naturally fluent, and alongside Rosemary, whose situation required constant management. And what she had absorbed from both was a specific kind of alertness. She watched how things worked and how they failed. She watched what the family systems could hold and what they could not. She did not have Kathleen's ease, but she had something that in the long run proved more durable, an ability to take the family's energy and direct it outward into structures that could outlast individual performance. By the late 1940s, Eunice was working in Washington. She had a position with the Justice Department's juvenile delinquency program, and she approached it with an intensity that people who worked alongside her consistently described in the same terms. She worked harder than anyone else in the room, expected the same from everyone around her, and had a low tolerance for the gap between stated intentions and actual outcomes. She was not, by the accounts of people who knew her in this period, particularly easy to work with. She was demanding, direct to the point of bluntness, and organized around results in a way that left little room for the ordinary social maintenance that makes institutional life function smoothly. These qualities made her effective and intermittently difficult, and very much her father's child. In 1953, she married Sergeant Shriver, a match that was, unlike her sister's romantic histories, uncomplicated by religious or family opposition. Shriver was Catholic, capable, ambitious in ways that ran parallel to the Kennedy Project rather than against it. He would become, over the following decades, one of the more genuinely significant figures in American public life. Director of the Peace Corps, ambassador to France, a vice presidential candidate. Their partnership was real in the sense that mattered. They worked alongside each other, shared a framework for what public life was for, and built something together that neither would have built alone. But before the marriage, and running underneath the professional life and the Washington work and the Shriver partnership, there was Rosemary. Eunice knew more than most of her siblings. This is suggested by the specificity of what she eventually said publicly, by the timing of certain decisions she made, and by the accounts of people who were close to her in the 1950s. She knew or had come to understand more of the truth about what had happened to Rosemary than the family's official version supplied. Whether her father had told her directly or whether she had assembled it from fragments, the institutional placement, the severity of Rosemary's condition, the timeline of the family's management decisions, is not fully recoverable. What is recoverable is that she carried the knowledge for years before she did anything with it, and that the weight of carrying it shaped what she eventually built. The Special Olympics did not exist yet. The Kennedy Foundation, established by Joseph Kennedy in 1946, had been funding research into intellectual disability since its early years. This was, on its face, philanthropy, and it was also the management of a private history through public means. The Foundation's grants went to institutions, to researchers, to programs that worked with intellectually disabled children. The money was real, and the research it funded was real. The gap between the Foundation's public rationale, general concern for an underserved population, and its private origin, a specific daughter, a specific decision, a specific outcome that required some form of ongoing response, was maintained carefully and without explicit acknowledgement. Eunice worked within this structure and then began in the mid-1950s to push beyond it. She was not satisfied with the Foundation's model of funding institutions at arm's length. She wanted to be in the room. She began visiting state institutions for the intellectually disabled, the large, underfunded warehouses that constituted the American system for managing this population in the post-war period. And the visits produced in her a response that was, by the accounts of people who accompanied her, genuinely visceral. The conditions she found were not the conditions of St. Coletta, where Kennedy money had built Rosemary a private cottage and ensured attentive care. They were wards of 50 and 60 people, minimal staffing, no programming, no education, no expectation that the people inside were capable of development or deserving of dignity. She went back repeatedly. She took notes. She asked questions that the administrators were not accustomed to being asked. What she was doing, understood one way, was converting private guilt or private knowledge, which in this family served a similar function, into institutional action. The sister who had been managed and hidden and then destroyed by a procedure arranged without her consent was providing the emotional engine for a project that would eventually change how American society understood and treated intellectual disability. This is not a comfortable observation because it contains both something genuine and something that cannot be fully separated from the family's long history of converting Rosemary's existence into something more manageable for the people around her. Eunice began, in the late 1950s, organizing summer camps at her Maryland estate, Timberlawn, for children with intellectual disabilities. This is the origin of what would become the Special Olympics. The camps were direct and physical. Eunice believed, against the prevailing institutional wisdom of the period, that intellectually disabled children could participate in athletic activity, could be trained, could compete, could experience the specific quality of confidence that physical achievement produced. She ran the camps herself. She was on the field. She did not administer from a distance in the way the foundation model had operated. She was present in the way that her family had not been present for Rosemary. The irony of this, that the most direct expression of care for intellectually disabled people in the Kennedy family came from the sister rather than the parents, and that it came 2 decades after the parents' most consequential failure of care, is not lost in the record, though it is not named in it. It exists in the gap between what the family had done and what Eunice was now doing, visible to anyone who looked at both. She was also simultaneously constructing a public version of the family's history with Rosemary that was not yet complete. The full story had not been told. The lobotomy had not been named publicly. What Eunice was building was real, and it was also, in some respects, a structure being erected over a foundation that had not yet been fully disclosed. For 20 years, Rosemary Kennedy did not exist in the public record of one of the most documented families in America. This requires some unpacking, because the erasure was not a single decision made on a single day. It was a practice, something maintained through repeated small choices, through the management of individual conversations, through the cultivation of journalists and the careful shaping of the family narrative that accelerated through the 1950s as John Kennedy's political profile grew. The mechanics of it were not complicated. When journalists asked about the Kennedy children, Rosemary was not mentioned. When the family was photographed at public events, Rosemary was not present. When profiles of the family appeared in magazines and through the 1950s, as John moved from the Senate toward the presidency, these profiles multiplied and grew more detailed. The siblings were named and described, and their activities cataloged, and Rosemary's name did not appear. She had been edited out not through a single explicit instruction, but through the consistent application of the same instinct the family had always applied to her, that she was not to be made legible to the outside world. The people who knew had various reasons for maintaining the silence. Joseph Kennedy's reasons were the ones that had organized the situation from the beginning. Reputation, control, the management of a public image that had material political consequences. By the early 1950s, those consequences were specific and high stakes. John Kennedy was a senator, and the presidency was the direction everything was pointed, and the Catholic constituency that was central to any national Kennedy campaign had a particular investment in the family's image as a model of Catholic rectitude. The story of a daughter destroyed by a lobotomy, arranged unilaterally by her father, kept in an institution in Wisconsin, unvisited by her mother for 2 decades, did not fit inside that image. Rose Kennedy's reasons were different. Her memoir suggests that the distance she maintained from Rosemary was something she understood through the lens of her faith, that she had offered her suffering to God, that she had found peace through prayer, that the separation was in some sense spiritually managed rather than chosen. What her memoir does not address is the daily reality of the choice, that she had a daughter in Wisconsin whom she did not visit, and that the not visiting continued for 20 years, and that during those 20 years she attended public events, gave interviews, cultivated a public image as a devoted mother, and did not go to Wisconsin. The other Kennedy children maintained the silence, partly because they had been given an incomplete account and partly because questioning it would have required a kind of direct confrontation with their father that was not, in the Kennedy family's internal culture, a thing that happened. Joseph Kennedy was not a man whose decisions were revisited once made. The family's internal dynamic did not produce children who pushed back against him on matters he had closed. They had been raised in a household where dinner table performance mattered and where the measurement of children against each other was constant. And what that produced was not a culture of open disagreement, but a culture of redirection, of finding other outlets for energy that might otherwise have taken the form of challenge. The silence also required the cooperation of people outside the family. The journalists who covered the Kennedys in the 1950s operated within a set of conventions that are difficult to recover fully now. A period in which the private lives of public figures were understood, by mutual agreement between press and subject, to be largely off-limits if the subject chose to keep them so. This was not unique to the Kennedys. It was the standard operating procedure of American political journalism in the post-war period. But the Kennedys were particularly skilled at cultivating the relationships that made the convention work in their favor. Access was exchanged for discretion, and the journalists who spent time with the family and produced the profiles that shaped public perception were, by the nature of the arrangement, inside a relationship that made adversarial inquiry uncomfortable and professionally costly. Rosemary, in these years, received visitors at St. Coletta on a limited basis. The nuns who cared for her have described, in accounts given long after the fact, a life that was structured and calm and bounded in every direction. She had her cottage, she had the grounds, she had the nuns who knew her and tended to her with what appears to have been genuine affection. She went to Mass. She did simple tasks, setting tables, folding laundry, that gave her days a shape. She could walk. She could communicate in limited ways. She could respond to kindness and express preferences in the ways available to her. She was not in a ward of 50. Kennedy money had ensured that her physical circumstances were not the circumstances of the broader American institutional system. What Kennedy money had not provided and could not provide was a family. Her father did not visit. Her mother did not visit. The siblings visited rarely, with the exception of Eunice, who began going to Wisconsin with increasing frequency as the decade wore on, and whose visits Rosemary appears to have responded to with the warmth that had always characterized her before the procedure. The nuns noted that she was animated when Eunice came, that she held onto her sister's hands, that after the visits she was unsettled for a day or two in a way that resolved eventually into the ordinary routine, and that the pattern repeated each time. What Rosemary understood about the world outside St. Coletta is genuinely unknowable. The nuns have described her as someone who could follow simple television programs, who could recognize faces. Whether she encountered her brothers on television, John on news broadcasts, the Senate hearings, eventually the presidential campaign, and whether she connected what she saw to the brother she had grown up with, is not something anyone thought to document carefully or ask her directly in ways that her limited communication could have confirmed or denied. Whether anyone sat with her and explained that her brother was running for president of the United States, that her sister Eunice was building a program in her name, that the family she had come from was becoming the most photographed family in America, is not recorded. The absence of this record is its own kind of answer. Patricia Kennedy was born in 1924, the fifth child and fourth daughter, and she grew up in the particular atmospheric condition of being neither the eldest nor the youngest, neither the most capable nor the one who required the most management. In a family that sorted its children into legible categories, Joe the heir, Jack the alternative, Bobby the engine, Teddy the youngest son, Kathleen the socially gifted, Eunice the driven, Rosemary the problem, Pat occupied a position that resisted easy categorization. She was attractive, she was charming in a quieter register than Kathleen, she was intelligent without being organized around her intelligence the way Eunice was. She did not, in the family's internal accounting, have a clear assigned role, and this turned out to be its own kind of pressure. Jean Kennedy, born in 1928, was the youngest daughter and the last Kennedy child before Teddy. She arrived into a household whose dynamics were already fully formed, whose hierarchies were established, whose emotional weather was set. She was 7 years younger than Eunice, 8 years younger than Pat, and the gap meant that she grew up alongside a family that was already in motion rather than one she had helped to build. By the time Jan was forming her earliest memories, Kathleen was a teenager navigating London society in rehearsal. Rosemary was already the subject of management strategies that the family did not discuss openly, and the household's energy was organized around the older children in ways that left the younger ones to absorb the atmosphere without fully participating in it. Both Pat and Jean were sent to the Catholic schools that the family used. Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, in Pat's case, the same institution Rose Kennedy had attended. The education was rigorous in some respects and oriented, in the way of Catholic women's education of the period, toward producing women who would manage households and support husbands and maintain the faith in the next generation. It did not, in either sister's case, produce a clear professional or intellectual direction. What it produced was two women who had been educated to a certain level and then positioned at the threshold of the marriage market that the family understood as the natural destination of daughters. Pat married Peter Lawford in 1954. Lawford was a British actor, charming, socially connected in the specific world of Hollywood celebrity, and possessed of a set of private difficulties that were not fully apparent at the time of the marriage. He drank. He used drugs with increasing seriousness as the years went on. He was, in the company of the Kennedys, always slightly peripheral. Tolerated for his connections, for his ease in certain social worlds the family wanted access to, for the fact of the marriage itself. And his relationship to the family had the quality of a man who understood he was adjacent to something larger than himself and was not certain how to manage that understanding. Pat's marriage to him was, in the early years, presented publicly as a glamorous match. Hollywood and the Kennedys, the two great American celebrity industries of the post-war period, briefly joined. What it was privately was more complicated. Pat had 5 children with Lawford. The accounts of their marriage from people who knew them describe a relationship that deteriorated progressively through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Lawford's substance use worsened. His behavior became less manageable. The gap between the public version of the marriage and its private reality widened. Pat continued. She maintained the surface of the marriage for years, past the point where the surface was connected to anything underneath it, which was what the family's culture had prepared her to do. The management of appearances was not an abstract value in the Kennedy household. It was a practical skill that had been modeled and reinforced since childhood, and Pat applied it to her marriage with the same competence she had been trained to apply to everything else. When she eventually divorced Lawford in 1966, it was after John Kennedy was dead and the particular period in which the marriage had served its social function had ended. The divorce was handled quietly and without the kind of extended public drama that might have attached to it in a family less skilled at managing such things. She received custody of the children. She moved to New York. She did not, in the years following, build anything in the public sphere that carried her name in the way Eunice's work did. She became, in the public record, primarily a figure defined by her relation to the more famous Kennedys. John's sister, Eunice's sister, the one who had been married to the actor. Jean's marriage in 1956 was to Stephen Smith, a businessman who became the Kennedy family's financial manager and political organizer, the person who ran the machinery rather than being the face of it. Smith was capable and discreet and understood his role precisely, which was to be useful rather than prominent. The marriage was, by the accounts available, more stable than Pat's, and Jean's public profile was quieter than any of her siblings. She worked in democratic politics, she involved herself in philanthropic causes, she was present at the events that defined the family's public life in the 1960s without ever becoming a primary figure in them. What both sisters shared, beneath the different textures of their marriages and their public invisibility, was a particular kind of experience that the family's structure produced in its peripheral members. The experience of being in close proximity to significance without being the location of it. They had grown up in a household where the stakes were high and the attention was unevenly distributed, and the message, delivered through 1,000 small daily signals, rather than any single explicit statement, was that some children were the point and others were the support structure. They had been prepared for marriage and public grace and the maintenance of family dignity, and these were real skills that required real effort, and none of them were the kind of skills that produced an independent legacy. There was also, underneath everything, the shared experience of growing up alongside Rosemary and then losing her. Not to death, but to something harder to name, to the procedure and the silence and the managed absence that had followed. Both Pat and Jean had been told, as children and young adults, an incomplete story about their eldest sister, and they had grown up inside that incompleteness, absorbing its particular quality of unanswered questions that were not to be asked. Neither of them, in anything that survives from this period, appears to have asked. In September 1962, the Saturday Evening Post published an article titled "Hope for Retarded Children." The byline was Eunice Kennedy Shriver. It was the first time a member of the Kennedy family had spoken publicly about intellectual disability in connection with their own family, and it was the first time Rosemary's existence had been acknowledged in print in any form that connected her to the family's story. The article had been in preparation for some time. Eunice had been working toward this disclosure for years, building the institutional infrastructure, the summer camp program, the foundation's public profile that would give the disclosure a context, rather than leaving it to land in an empty field. The article was careful. It was not a confession. It did not name the lobotomy. It did not describe what Joseph Kennedy had decided in 1941, or what had resulted from that decision. What it did was establish for the first time publicly that the Kennedys had a family member with an intellectual disability, that this was the private origin of the family's public philanthropic work in this area, and that Eunice had a personal investment in the cause that went beyond policy or charity. She wrote about visiting institutions for the intellectually disabled and finding conditions she described as inadequate. She wrote about what she believed was possible for people who had been written off by the system. She wrote about the summer camp she had been running at Timberlawn. Rosemary was mentioned by name. She was described as having been born with an intellectual disability, as having been educated in special schools, as being cared for in an institution. This much was true. What was not said widely, what would not be said publicly for decades more, was the rest of it. The timing of the article was not accidental. John Kennedy was president. He had been in office for less than 2 years, and his administration had made intellectual disability one of its domestic policy priorities. The President's Panel on Mental Retardation had been established in 1961, and federal legislation addressing the institutional system was being prepared. The article appeared inside this political context, which meant it functioned simultaneously as personal disclosure and policy advocacy, which was precisely the kind of dual operation the Kennedys had always been most comfortable with. The personal converted into the public, the private history made to serve a larger stated purpose. The reaction to the article was significant. The volume of correspondence it generated, letters from families with intellectually disabled members, from institutional workers, from physicians and educators, was, by the accounts of people in the Kennedy organization who managed it, larger than the response to almost anything else a Kennedy family member had published. This was 1962, and the population of American families with intellectually disabled members who had been managing their situations in the same silence the Kennedys had maintained was enormous, and the article had named something they had been carrying without public acknowledgement. The response had the quality that attaches to disclosures of this kind, the relief of recognition of a private experience being reflected back from a public source. What the article did not produce was a full reckoning. Joseph Kennedy was still alive in 1962. He would live until 1969, though a stroke in December 1961 had left him severely impaired, unable to speak, spending the last 8 years of his life in the same condition of dependence and managed care that he had arranged for Rosemary. He could not have participated in a public conversation about what he had decided in 1941, even if he had wanted to, and there is no evidence that he had wanted to. The stroke had arrived before the article, and the article's careful navigation of what to say and what to leave unsaid may have been shaped, at least in part, by his continued presence. Rose Kennedy was 72 in 1962. She had not yet resumed regular contact with Rosemary. That would come later in the 1960s, when she began visiting Wisconsin, and the accounts of those visits describe an elderly woman sitting with her daughter, holding her hands, conducting a relationship that had no possibility of returning to what it had been before 1941. Whether Rose had read her daughter's Saturday Evening Post article and recognized in it the outline of the story she had been part of, or whether the article's careful omissions allowed her to receive it as something less than a full accounting, is not recoverable. She did not, in anything that survives, respond to it in writing. Eunice's brother John had been briefed on the article before publication. He had been kept informed of Eunice's institutional advocacy for years, had signed legislation connected to it, had spoken in public about the importance of addressing intellectual disability as a policy matter. His position in relation to the family's history with Rosemary was one that required him to simultaneously acknowledge the cause and maintain the version of the story that had been established. That Rosemary had been born with a disability, that the family had sought the best care available, that their philanthropy was the expression of their concern. The lobotomy remained outside this version. The article's publication also had an effect on the family members who had grown up inside the silence. Pat and Jean and Ted had been told, over the years, varying versions of what had happened to Rosemary, and the article's acknowledgement of her existence in print and in a national magazine under a family member's name shifted something. The silence had been external as well as internal, a silence maintained toward the world, and the article ended the external silence while leaving the internal one largely intact. They could now speak publicly about having a sister with a disability. They could not yet speak publicly about what had been done to her. The letters kept coming in for weeks after the article appeared. Eunice responded to many of them personally, or had responses sent on her behalf. They came from parents who had hidden their children's conditions for the same reasons the Kennedys had hidden Rosemary's, from the same fear of stigma and the same pressure toward the management of appearance that the American social landscape of the post-war period had imposed on families dealing with disability. The article had, at minimum, made those families slightly less alone. What it had not done was tell them the whole story. The whole story would take decades more to fully emerge, and by the time it did, most of the people who had made the decisions it described would be dead. The Special Olympics held its first international games in Chicago in July 1968. 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities competed at Soldier Field, track and field events, floor hockey, aquatic sports. Eunice Kennedy Shriver stood at the opening ceremony and delivered remarks that were direct and unambiguous. These athletes were capable, they were competitive, they deserved the same recognition that athletic achievement produced in anyone else. The crowd was large, the coverage was national. It was, by any reasonable measure, a genuine public event with genuine consequences for how American society understood the population it was celebrating. Rosemary Kennedy was 50 years old that summer. She was in Jefferson, Wisconsin. This juxtaposition does not require commentary. It sits in the record and asks to be looked at directly. The sister whose existence had generated, through the complex machinery of guilt and philanthropy and public positioning, an international athletic competition, attended by 1,000 people, watching none of it from a cottage on the grounds of a Catholic institution in the Midwest. Whether she was told about the Special Olympics, whether anyone explained to her that her sister had built something in the world that was connected to her, is not documented. The nuns at St. Coletta have not left accounts describing a conversation of that kind. The Kennedy Foundation's investment in intellectual disability programs had grown substantially through the 1960s. Federal legislation had followed the president's panel recommendations. The Maternal and Child Health and Mental Retardation Planning Amendments of 1963 had passed weeks before John Kennedy's assassination, and their passage had been driven in part by the administration's personal investment in the cause, which was itself driven by the family's private history. Money from the federal government began flowing into research, into community programs, into the deinstitutionalization movement that would eventually, imperfectly, incompletely, with consequences that are still being reckoned with, dismantle the large warehouse institutions that Eunice had visited in the 1950s and found unconscionable. The Special Olympics grew. By the mid-1970s, it had expanded to dozens of countries. By the 1980s, it was a permanent international institution with its own bureaucracy, its own funding streams, its own political relationships. Eunice remained its primary force. She was not an administrator who managed from a distance, but a presence who showed up, who pushed, who argued with people who suggested the organization had grown large enough to operate without her direct involvement. She had inherited her father's quality of absolute certainty about her own judgment, and she applied it to the Special Olympics with the same intensity he had applied to everything he had touched. The tension embedded in the organization's origin was not publicly discussed during these years of growth. The narrative that surrounded the Special Olympics, and it was a powerful narrative, genuinely moving, connecting family love and public service and the transformation of private grief into something that helped people, did not include the full account of what had happened to Rosemary. The lobotomy was still not public. The decision Joseph Kennedy had made in 1941, the outcome it had produced, the 20 years of institutional silence, these remained outside the story the organization told about itself. What the organization told about itself was the version that had been established in the 1962 Saturday Evening Post article. A family had a member with an intellectual disability. The family had been changed by that experience. The family had converted that change into action. This version was true as far as it went. It did not go to the place where the fuller truth required it to go. The philanthropy also operated within the broader context of Kennedy wealth, which by the 1960s and 1970s was substantial and diversifying and managed by the family's financial apparatus with the same attention to positioning that the family brought to its political and public activities. The foundation's grants were not small. They funded research institutions, built facilities, endowed university programs. The scale of the giving was real. It also produced for the family the specific benefit that large-scale philanthropy has always produced for wealthy families: legitimacy, access, the conversion of a private fortune into a public reputation for generosity. These two things, the genuine good accomplished and the reputational benefit accrued, were not separable in the Kennedy Foundation's operation, and the attempt to separate them produces a picture more comfortable than the actual one. Eunice's relationship to this complexity was not simple. She was not a cynical operator deploying philanthropy as reputation management. The accounts of her direct involvement with athletes, with institutions, with individual families are too consistent and too specific to support that reading. She was genuinely moved by what she saw. She worked with a ferocity that went beyond what public positioning required, and she also operated within a family system that had specific reasons for wanting the cause associated with its name, and she was sufficiently her father's daughter to understand the value of those reasons without needing to examine them directly. The deinstitutionalization movement that the Foundation's early funding had helped catalyze produced, by the 1970s and 1980s, outcomes that were more complicated than its advocates had anticipated. Large institutions were closed, but the community infrastructure that was supposed to replace them was underfunded, and in many cases non-existent. People who had been moved out of institutions found themselves in inadequate community placements, or homeless, or cycling through other institutional systems, jails, emergency rooms, shelters that were less equipped to serve them than the institutions that had been replaced. The movement's ambitions had outrun its implementation, and the people most affected were the people with the fewest resources to manage the gap. The Kennedy Foundation continued its work through this period without substantially reckoning with the consequences of the deinstitutionalization it had supported. The Special Olympics expanded. The legislative advocacy continued. The narrative of progress was maintained. The complications were managed in the way that complications were generally managed within the Kennedy orbit. Not by denial exactly, but by directing attention toward what was working, rather than examining what was not. Rosemary Kennedy remained at St. Coletta. She was not deinstitutionalized. Kennedy money ensured that her care remained stable through the policy shifts that disrupted the lives of others in comparable situations. The institution that had been adequate for her specific needs continued to provide what she required, and the family's resources continued to fund it. She was, in this respect, insulated from the consequences of the broader policy changes that the family's advocacy had helped produce. The insulation was real. So was the distance it maintained. Rosemary Kennedy died on January 7th, 2005, at the age of 86. She had spent 63 years at St. Coletta School in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She had outlived her father, her mother, 3 of her brothers, and her sister Kathleen. She had outlived the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the Chappaquiddick incident, the deaths of John Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, the accumulated public catastrophes of a family whose tragedies had become a genre of American storytelling. She had outlived almost all of it from a cottage on the grounds of a Catholic institution in a small Wisconsin city, tended by nuns who knew her name and her preferences and the particular quality of her responses to the people she trusted. Her death was announced by the Kennedy family with a brief statement. The coverage it received was respectful and, in several outlets, surprisingly detailed. By 2005, the fuller story of what had happened to her had been circulating in Kennedy biographies for some years, and the obituaries reflected this. They described the lobotomy. They described Joseph Kennedy's unilateral decision. They described the outcome. They described the 63 years at St. Coletta. They did these things in the measured language of obituary journalism, which has its own conventions for managing the distance between what happened and how it is named. But the facts were present in a way they had not been during most of her life. The family's statement did not address any of this directly. It described her as a beloved sister and aunt, expressed gratitude for the care she had received at St. Coletta, and noted the connection between her life and the work of the Kennedy Foundation and the Special Olympics. The statement converted her death into an occasion for affirming the legacy that had been built in connection with her existence, which was what the family had been doing with her existence since 1962. The woman herself, what she had experienced, what had been done to her, what her 63 years at St. Coletta had actually consisted of, was present in the statement only as an occasion for the legacy's reiteration. Eunice Kennedy Shriver survived her sister by 4 years. She died in August 2009 at 88. By the time of her death, the Special Olympics had become an organization operating in nearly 200 countries, serving millions of athletes. The scale of what she had built was genuinely remarkable, and the people who had been touched by it, athletes, families, the broader population whose understanding of intellectual disability had been changed by the organization's 4 decades of work, were real and numerous. Her obituaries were largely celebratory, which was appropriate given the scope of what she had accomplished, and they also, in the better ones, noted the origin. Rosemary, the lobotomy, the family's long silence, the particular shape of the transformation from private failure to public institution. The question that the obituaries generally did not press was the one that remains most difficult. What was owed to Rosemary herself, specifically, as a person rather than as an origin story? The Special Olympics had changed the world for millions of people with intellectual disabilities. It had not changed Rosemary's world. She had spent 63 years in the same institution, her daily life organized by the same routines, visited by family members with varying degrees of regularity, connected to the broader world in no systematic way. The organization built in connection with her existence had not organized itself around her actual needs, her actual experience, her actual relationship to the family that had placed her there. It had organized itself around what her existence made possible for others. This is not a simple observation, because the good done for others was real, but the substitution of impact on strangers for relationship with the person whose situation generated the cause is a substitution worth naming, and it is one that the family never named directly. Rose Kennedy visited Rosemary regularly in her final years. The visits are described in accounts from the institution as warm, in the limited way they could be warm. An elderly mother and her severely impaired daughter, sitting together, the mother holding her daughter's hands, the conversation that was not possible replaced by simple physical presence. Rose Kennedy died in 1995, 10 years before Rosemary, at the age of 104. She had lived long enough to see her sons assassinated, her grandchildren die young, her family's public story become a permanent American fixture. She had outlived almost everything she had built and lost almost everyone she had built it with. Whether the visits to Wisconsin in her final decades constituted something that could be called reconciliation, or whether they were simply the last available form of a relationship that had been broken too completely to be rebuilt, is not knowable from the outside. The nuns who observed them describe an old woman who came and sat and held her daughter's hands, and then left. What Rose Kennedy experienced during those visits, what she understood about the distance between what she had done and what she was doing now, remains inside the silence she maintained about the interior life of the choice she had been complicit in, by absence and by faith, for 6 decades. Ted Kennedy visited Rosemary more frequently than most of his siblings in her later years. He was the last surviving brother, and the accounts describe him arriving at St. Coletta with a directness that the nuns found genuine. He knew her caregivers by name. He spent real time rather than performing presence. He was present in the way that Eunice had been present during the years of her advocacy. Whether this late attentiveness represented something resolved or something still being worked through is not answerable. He did not write about it at length. His memoir, published shortly before his death in 2009, addresses Rosemary in terms that are affectionate and careful, and that do not reach the place the full history requires. The cottage at St. Coletta where Rosemary lived for 6 decades still exists. The institution continues to operate. Her grave is on the grounds, near the cottage, in a place that is quiet and institutional, and a long distance from Edensor churchyard in Derbyshire, where Kathleen is buried among the family she chose. The 1938 photograph exists in archives. Rosemary stands slightly apart, holding a pose she had been shown. The Kennedy family produced across the 20th century an unusual density of public record: speeches, letters, photographs, biographies, government documents, oral histories. The machinery of documentation followed them from Boston to London to Washington and back, and it preserved in extraordinary detail the surface of what they did and said and chose. What it did not preserve, because it could not, was what any of it cost the people inside it. Rosemary Kennedy's name appears in that record primarily in relation to other things: her father's ambition, her mother's faith, her sister's philanthropy, the legislation her brother signed. She appears as context, as origin, as the private fact that explains the public gesture. In the fraction of the record that belongs to her directly, the labored letters, the brief diary, the nuns' accounts of her daily life at St. Coletta, she appears as someone who had preferences and responses and the capacity for warmth, and who spent the better part of a century in a cottage in Wisconsin, while her family became one of the most photographed in the world. Kathleen Kennedy's grave in Edensor is visited occasionally by people who know the story. The stone identifies her as her father's daughter and her husband's wife. The inscription says nothing about what she chose or what it cost her, or the specific quality of aliveness that the people who knew her described for decades afterward, with a precision that suggests they were trying to preserve something they were afraid of losing. The 1962 Saturday Evening Post article is in archives. The letters it generated by messager solicitors from families who had been carrying the same silence in smaller houses with fewer resources are presumably in archives too, or lost. The Special Olympics continues. The Kennedy Foundation continues. The institutions built on a history that was only partially disclosed continue to operate under the weight of what was said and the weight of what was not. Rosemary's diary, the one she kept briefly in her late teens, describes a dance she attended. She writes the name of a young man she found handsome. She writes that she had a good time. The entry ends there.